Case 1. Susan Eubanks. On the evening of Sunday the 26th of October 1997, in a small rented house on the outskirts of San Marcos, California, a 33-year-old mother killed her 4 sons inside the family home. She killed them with the same 5-shot revolver in 2 rooms of the house, one after the other. The youngest was 4, the oldest was 14. Her 5-year-old nephew, tucked into bed in the same house with the covers pulled up to his chin, was the only child under that roof who lived through the night. When sheriff's deputies arrived in response to a call from the boy's father, they found her on her bed, still alive, with the gun beside her hand. The mother's name was Susan Diane Eubanks. She had been born in 1964. By the autumn of 1997, she was 33 years old, twice married, 3 times separated, and the mother of 4 boys by 3 different fathers. She had been raised in California and Texas. She had worked before becoming a homemaker as a nursing assistant. She had no felony record. She had no history of violence. By the standards of her neighbours in San Marcos, she was a tired single mother in a small rented house in a quiet pocket of San Diego County, who was, by autumn of that year, drinking too much and not coping well. Susan's own life in the years before that October had been a series of difficult endings. Her first husband, John Armstrong, had been a Texas man with whom she had had Brandon. They had divorced. Her second husband, Eric Eubanks, was a cabinet maker from California. They had married in 1990. They had had Brigham and Matthew together. By 1997, that marriage had also collapsed. The divorce papers had been filed on the 5th of September. Eric had moved out. Susan was raising the 4 boys, plus her late brother's 5-year-old son, alone, on what little she had managed to keep from each settlement. Renee Dodson had moved in to help with the rent. He was, by every account, a peaceable man, who had walked away rather than escalate. He had not been the one she had ended up turning the gun on. What was not visible from the outside, by the testimony her sister Michelle Smith gave to investigators in the months after the killings, was the full picture. Susan had filed for divorce from her second husband, Eric Eubanks, on the 5th of September. She was carrying about $40,000 in credit card debt. She was abusing alcohol and a prescription anti-anxiety medication. Michelle Smith would later tell investigators that she had been calling San Diego County Child Protective Services repeatedly to report what she had been seeing in her sister's house, and that she had not, in her own description, been getting follow-up. The 4 boys lived with her. Brandon Armstrong, the 14-year-old, was an 8th grader. He was the son of her first husband, John Armstrong, of Texas. Austin Eubanks was 7. Brigham Eubanks was 6. Matthew Eubanks was 4. Austin had been fathered by an earlier partner of Susan's named Larry Shoebridge. Brigham and Matthew were the sons of Eric Eubanks, the cabinet maker she had married in 1990 and had filed to divorce that September. The 5th child in the house, the only one not Susan's biological son, was her 5-year-old nephew Aaron Storm Stanley. Aaron was the son of Susan's late brother John. He had been in Susan's care for some time. On the afternoon of Sunday the 26th of October 1997, Susan Eubanks and her live-in boyfriend Renee Dodson spent several hours at a bar called the North Bar on West El Norte Parkway in nearby Escondido, drinking and watching the Chargers game. They fought. They drove back to the house in San Marcos. Once they were home, Susan punctured 2 of Dodson's tyres and unplugged the phone. Dodson walked to a gas station and called the sheriff's office for a peacekeeping escort so he could collect his belongings and leave. While Dodson was loading his things into the deputy's patrol car, Susan was screaming in the front yard. She screamed, at no one in particular, that she had been screwed by men her whole life, that she had been beaten, that she had been abused. Dodson, by his later account to investigators, was afraid she was about to take her own life. He told Eric Eubanks, who had arrived to pick up his 2 sons, that Susan was, in his words, kind of whacked, that she had been talking about killing herself and the boys. Eric Eubanks left with his children, then came back later to drop the older ones home. At some point around 6 or 7 in the evening, Susan paged Eric and left a voicemail of just 2 words. The 2 words were, "Say goodbye." She also called John Armstrong in Texas. Eric called 911. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the small rented house at around 7:30 in the evening. They could hear moaning from inside. What they found inside is the part of this case that this account is going to describe at the level of fact and not at the level of crime scene photograph. Brandon, the 14-year-old, was on the living room floor with his cereal bowl spilled beside him. Austin, the 7-year-old, was upright on the top bunk in the children's bedroom. Brigham, the 6-year-old, was on the bottom bunk. Matthew, the 4-year-old, was on the bottom bunk with him. All four had been killed with the same 5-shot revolver. 3 of them were dead at the scene. 4-year-old Matthew was still breathing when paramedics arrived and died en route to Palomar Medical Center. Susan Eubanks was on her own bed in a separate room. She had tried to take her own life. She had not succeeded. 5 handwritten letters were on the bedroom floor beside her. Her 5-year-old nephew Aaron was in his own bed, the covers pulled to his chin, untouched. He was the only child in the house alive and unhurt. The toxicology that came back in the days that followed answered the question of premeditation. 2 of the 4 boys had been given a sedative in measurable quantities before they had been shot. Crime scene reconstructionist Rod Englert later testified that Brandon, the eldest, had been sitting in the living room with the cereal bowl when the first shot was fired. The other 3 had been in their own bunk beds. The 5 suicide notes Susan Eubanks had left in her bedroom were addressed to the men in her life. The note to Eric Eubanks accused him of betraying her. The note to John Armstrong in Texas told him that she could not let Brandon live without his brothers, and so she had done what she had done. A friend of Renee Dodson's named Debbie McNeil later told investigators that Susan had told her 2 weeks before that Sunday that she had bought bullets. Susan had told her, by McNeil's account, that one of the bullets was for Dodson. None of the bullets in the end were used on Dodson. All 5 rounds in the 5-shot revolver had been used on her 4 sons and on herself. The note to John Armstrong was the closest she came in any of the 5 letters she left on the bedroom floor to giving a reason. She could not, in that letter, let Brandon live without his brothers. That was the only sentence in any of the 5 letters that read like a planning sentence rather than an accusing sentence. San Diego County Sheriff's Department processed the scene over the 48 hours that followed. Susan Eubanks survived emergency surgery at Palomar Medical Center. She was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, making her death eligible under California law. Her trial began in August of 1999 before San Diego County Superior Court Judge Joan Weber. The lead prosecutor was San Diego County Deputy District Attorney Bonnie Howard Regan. Howard Regan's theory of the case was a theory of revenge. Susan, in Howard Regan's framing, had been fueled by anger against the men she perceived had betrayed her. The killing of her children, in this account, had been her way of making them suffer. Howard Regan, in her closing, told the jury that Susan Eubanks had not been able to control the men in her life any longer, and so the men in her life had had to suffer, even if it had meant taking away the lives of 4 innocent children. It was, in Howard Regan's words, callous, and it was cold. Per the San Diego County District Attorney's Office release in October of 2024, the jury deliberated for just 2 hours before convicting her on all 4 counts. After 2 more days, they returned a verdict of death. Judge Weber denied the defense motion to modify the sentence and formally imposed death on the 13th of October, 1999. Eubanks was transferred to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla and held on death row for the next 25 years. Her California Supreme Court appeals were rejected. With California's death penalty under Governor Gavin Newsom's 2019 moratorium and the 2006 federal injunction halting executions, San Diego County District Attorney Summer Stephan eventually moved to resolve the case through what California law calls prosecutor-initiated resentencing. On the 4th of October 2024, Judge Weber, the same judge who had imposed the death sentence 25 years before, resentenced Susan Eubanks, by then 60 years old, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. District Attorney Summer Stephan, announcing the resentencing in October of 2024, said that the California moratorium on the death penalty and the desire to spare the victim's family the anguish of a new evidentiary hearing had all factored into the decision. She added that the agreement was guaranteed, on its own terms, to keep Susan Eubanks behind bars for the rest of her life. Sally Armstrong, Brandon's grandmother, who had spent 25 years waiting on the legal process, asked reporters at the time of the resentencing why Eubanks had not, on the night she had decided to do what she did, just killed herself and left the children alone. Michelle Smith, Susan's sister, told the gathered press a different version of the same point. She had blamed San Diego County Child Protective Services in 1997 for not investigating her calls. She blamed them 27 years later, again. Brandon, Austin, Brigham and Matthew are buried together. Their 5-year-old cousin Aaron Storm Stanley, who had been tucked into bed in the same house with the covers pulled to his chin, lived through the night. He is a grown man now. Susan Eubanks is at the Central California Women's Facility for the rest of her life. The Eubanks case is the case of a mother who took revenge against the men in her life by ending the lives of the children she had with them. The next case on this list is something different. It is a mother who killed, not alongside an estranged husband or a boyfriend, but alongside her own grown daughter in a first-floor apartment in a small Pennsylvania borough after both of them had spent weeks convincing themselves that the world was about to end. Case 2. Shana Decree. In late February of 2019, in a first-floor apartment in the small Bucks County borough of Morrisville, Pennsylvania, 5 members of the same family were found dead. 3 of them were children, 2 were adults. They had been crammed into a single bedroom of the unit. The 2 surviving residents of the apartment, a 45-year-old mother and her 19-year-old daughter, were found alive, disoriented, in another bedroom. The mother and the daughter would, within hours, give the same answer to the same question. They had done it themselves. The mother's name was Shana Selena Decree. She had been 45 years old at the time of the killings. She had been living in a first-floor unit of the Robert Morris Apartments on West Bridge Street in Morrisville with her 3 children and her sister's twin daughters. Shana Decree had no prior criminal record. Her estranged husband, Damon Decree Sr., lived in North Carolina. Shana Decree's life before the killings had not been a public one. She had worked, on and off, in the kind of jobs that a low-income single parent in eastern Pennsylvania takes to keep her family housed. By the time the family had drifted into the Robert Morris Apartments on West Bridge Street in Morrisville, the household was strung across 3 generations. There was Shana. There was Shana's grown daughter Dominique, who was 19. There was Shana's grown daughter Naira, who was 25. There was Shana's 13-year-old son, Damon Jr. There was Shana's sister, Jamila Campbell, who was 42. And there were Jamila's 9-year-old twin daughters, Imani and Erica Allen. What had been happening inside the apartment in the weeks before the killings came out at the bond hearings and from the relatives who had been trying to reach the family. Shana, Jamila, and the adult daughter Dominique had retreated into the apartment together. They had pulled the children out of school. They had refused visitors. Their conversations, by every account of every relative who tried to reach them by phone, had become saturated with the language of demons and pearly gates and the end of the world. The world, by their account, was going to end on the 1st of March. The children needed to be made right before they walked through those gates with the adults of the household. Damon Decree Sr., in his statements to the press in the days after the killings, described the family as having become involved in what he called a cult that had materialized online. Morrisville Borough Police Chief George McClay would later be careful in his statements to the press about how to frame the family's beliefs. He told reporters that the cult framing his counterpart Damon Sr. had been offering had not been indicated, in his words, by anything the department had been able to confirm. What was clear from inside the apartment in the weeks before the killings was that the adults of the household had been telling each other and their children that the world was about to end. The children, by the school's account, were the first to disappear from their daily lives. They were no longer in class. They were no longer outside. The apartment door, increasingly, was no longer open. Ronald Smith, the father of the 25-year-old daughter, Naira, drove from Maryland to check on his daughter in those weeks. Naira would not let him in. She spoke to him through the door. She told him that she needed to make herself right before the pearly gates. She told him that the world was ending in days. Ronald Smith drove home not knowing what to do. He told a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer after the killings that he had known something was wrong with the household. He had not known how to make anyone act on it. He had been a father standing in a hallway in Pennsylvania, trying to get his own daughter to open a door. The door had not opened. The school in Morrisville did know what to do. On the 1st of February, the principal at the elementary school where Damon Jr. was a student called the Bucks County Children and Youth Social Services Agency to report that the 13-year-old had been missing class. A caseworker visited the apartment on the 5th of February. The caseworker found nothing suspicious enough to act on. The killings, by the medical examiner's findings, took place across the night of the 23rd and the morning of the 24th of February. 4 of the 5 family members died of asphyxiation. The 5th, Jamila Campbell, died of ligature. The 5 victims were Naira Smith, the 25-year-old cosmetology student who was a month from her graduation and was engaged to be married. Damon Decree Jr., the 13-year-old who had founded an anti-bullying group at his middle school called the Kindness Club. Jamila Campbell, Shana's 42-year-old sister, and Imani Allen and Erica Allen, Jamila's 9-year-old twin daughters, the twins who would have turned 10 that same week. Damon Jr., the 13-year-old, had been an 8th grader at Morrisville Junior Senior High. He had been the kind of child whose absence the school noticed within a week. The Kindness Club he had founded, an anti-bullying group built around the principle that small daily acts of decency mattered, was the kind of project a 13-year-old founds when he has been listening to the adult conversations around him for too long. Naira Smith, the 25-year-old, had been a month from graduating from cosmetology school. She had been engaged to be married. She had been the eldest sibling and, by her own father Ronald Smith's account in the weeks before her death, she had been the one in the household who was trying to find her own way out. On the morning of the 25th of February, a Monday, the same Bucks County children and youth caseworker who had visited 3 weeks earlier came back to the apartment for a follow-up. Nobody answered the door. A maintenance worker was called to let her in. The maintenance worker called 911 at 16 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. Police entered the apartment and found all 5 bodies in a single bedroom of the unit. Some were on the bed, some were upright against the walls. One had been pushed so hard that a foot had broken through into another room. The apartment was, in the language of the responding officers, in a state of complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, glass was broken. In a separate bedroom, on a bed, Shana Decree and her 19-year-old daughter Dominique were alive but disoriented. Dominique had fresh, superficial cuts on her own neck. Shana and Dominique gave different stories at first. Dominique, in the initial interview, blamed an unknown black man, a culturally familiar version of the false suspect framing this account will return to in the final case on this list. Shana said her sister's boyfriend had come in with 2 unknown men. Once the investigators ran each woman's account against the other, the 2 of them began to give the same account. Per the probable cause affidavit filed by the Morrisville Borough Police on the 26th of February, both women confirmed that Shana, Dominique and Jamila had ended the lives of the others first. Dominique had ended Jamila's life last. The framing both women used, after the conflicting stories had collapsed, was a framing of a final choice made together. Per the affidavit, Shana told the police that all of them, including the children, had been talking about the same thing in the weeks before. Bucks County District Attorney Matthew Weintraub called it an unspeakable tragedy. He declined, at the time, to call the family's stated framing a definitive motive. The case did not go to trial. On the 28th of September 2020, Shana Decree, by then 47 years old, and Dominique Decree, by then 21, pleaded guilty but mentally ill to 5 counts of first-degree murder each before Bucks County Court of Common Pleas Judge Wallace H. Bateman Jr. Chief Deputy District Attorney Christopher Rees prosecuted. Shana was represented by Ann P. Russavage Faust. Dominique was represented by the public defender Timothy J. Barton, with John Fioravanti Jr. as co-counsel. The plea of guilty but mentally ill, in Pennsylvania law, is a plea that holds the defendant criminally responsible while officially recognizing the role of mental illness. It carries the same sentencing options as a straight guilty plea. The 5 consecutive life terms each mother and daughter were given will, between them, ensure that neither leaves prison alive. Christopher Rees, in his sentencing memorandum, did not soften the case. The killings on his account had been the deliberate ending of 3 children's lives, of a young woman's life, and of a young aunt's life inside a delusional framework that the adults in the apartment had created and then enforced. The mental illness on his account was real. The criminal responsibility was also real. Both Shana and Dominique were sentenced the same day to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Damon Decree Sr., the father of the 13-year-old Damon Jr., addressed the court. He told Judge Bateman that the bottom line, for him, was that he had not done the number one job a parent has to do. He had not kept his son safe. He told the Philadelphia Inquirer in a separate interview that he had attempted to take his own life in the months after the killing of his son. The aftermath of the case settled, in Bucks County, on the role the county's own children and youth social services had played. A caseworker had been inside the apartment on the 5th of February. The killings had begun 18 days later. The agency's protocols for cases of family isolation and religious crisis became the subject of a sustained review. The review, conducted in the months that followed by the Bucks County Office of Children and Youth in coordination with the State Department of Human Services, found that the agency's response to school-referred truancy in cases that included evidence of social withdrawal had been thin. The 18 days between the caseworker's home visit on the 5th of February and the killings on the 23rd had been, in retrospect, the window in which the household had become entirely sealed. The protocols that came out of the review focused on a tighter follow-up window for cases where school absence was paired with reports of unusual family religious activity. The protocols were a departmental document. They were not, in the technical sense, a law. Damon Decree Jr. is remembered in Morrisville for the kindness club he had founded at the school. The school still runs the club. The students who joined it after the killings have, in their own way, made sure that the 8th grader who founded it did not become the only thing about him that anyone remembered. The Decree case is the case of a mother and her grown daughter who killed 5 members of the same family together on the same night in the same apartment, inside the framing of a shared belief that the world was about to end. The next case on this list takes us out of the supernatural framing entirely. It is the case of a registered nurse at a heart hospital in Arkansas on her last day on the job, who took drugs from her workplace home and used them on her own 2 small children. If this is the kind of true crime work you came here for, the subscribe button keeps it free and keeps the next case landing in your feed. Case 3. Christina Riggs. On the evening of Tuesday, the 4th of November 1997, in a duplex in Sherwood, Arkansas, a 26-year-old licensed practical nurse, on her last day working at a heart hospital, took her 2 small children home, sedated them, and then used drugs she had taken out of her own workplace pharmacy to end their lives. The plan had been her own death first and the children's second. The plan failed in the order it failed. Both children died. She survived. On the 2nd of May 2000, she became the first woman put to death in the state of Arkansas since the 1800s. The mother's name was Christina Marie Riggs. She had been born on the 2nd of September 1971 in Lawton, Oklahoma. By the autumn of 1997, she was 26 years old, a licensed practical nurse, a single mother, deeply in debt, clinically depressed, and on her way out of her job at Arkansas Heart Hospital. Her own childhood, by every account she gave to investigators and to the psychiatric experts who later examined her, had been a hard one. She had been abused as a child by family and by a neighbour. She had given up a child for adoption at 16. She had then trained as a nurse. She had had a son, Justin Dalton Thomas, in 1992, after a relationship with a serviceman who had initially denied paternity. She had married a sailor named John Riggs in 1993. Her daughter, Shelby Alexis Riggs, had been born in December of 1994. After her husband had hit Justin hard enough that the boy had needed medical attention, she had divorced him. The family had moved to Arkansas in 1995 after the Oklahoma City Federal Building was bombed in April of that year. Riggs's work at Arkansas Heart Hospital in Sherwood, just outside Little Rock, had been the only stability the family had had since the divorce. By the autumn of 1997, that stability was over. Her credit card debt was deep. Her depression was not being treated. Her ability to keep the lights on in the duplex she rented for the 3 of them was running out. The hospital had given her notice that her position was ending. The 4th of November was her last day in the building. The two children, by November of 1997, were 5 and almost 3. Justin was 5, Shelby was just under 3. They lived with their mother in a duplex in Sherwood, Pulaski County, Arkansas, near Little Rock. Christina Riggs was working at the Heart Hospital. She was, by the testimony her own defense psychiatrists later gave at trial, in a state of major depression and untreated post-traumatic stress. She had decided in the weeks leading up to that Tuesday that she was going to take her own life. She had decided in the same weeks that she could not leave her two children behind to be raised by other people. She had decided, by the testimony she herself gave at sentencing, that they were going with her. The plan she had committed to, by her own statements at sentencing and to her defense psychiatrists, was a plan of altruistic killing. She would die first. She had a horror, by her account, of leaving her two children to be passed between the family members who had failed her in her own childhood. They would not, in her thinking, survive a system she had not survived herself. The cleanest version of the plan was a sedative to put them to sleep, an injection to stop their hearts, and then her own death by the same drug. Potassium chloride was the drug. She had access to it. The injection had to be diluted. She did not dilute it. On the 4th of November 1997, her last day working at the hospital, Christina Riggs obtained Elavil, a tricyclic antidepressant, from her pharmacy. She took, without authorization, potassium chloride and morphine from the hospital's controlled substance cabinet. Potassium chloride is, in concentrated form, the drug used in lethal injections. She would have known that. She drove home that evening. She gave each of her children a measured dose of the Elavil dissolved in water. Both children fell asleep. Then the plan went the way the plan went. She injected her sleeping 5-year-old son in the neck with undiluted potassium chloride. The drug burned him. He woke, screaming. She injected him with the morphine. He stayed alive. She placed a pillow over his head. He fought her. She held the pillow. She then turned to her 2-year-old daughter. The 2-year-old did not wake. When both children were dead, Christina Riggs put both bodies on her own bed. She wrote suicide notes. She swallowed 28 Elavil tablets. She tried to inject herself with the same potassium chloride she had used on her son. The drug burned a hole in her arm rather than entering a vein. The Elavil knocked her unconscious. The next morning, her mother, Carol Thomas, drove to the duplex after Christina failed to show up at her own mother's house. Carol Thomas called 911. The dispatcher's tape captured what she said. Her daughter and her babies were dead. Christina Riggs was rushed to a hospital. She survived. She was arrested at her bedside on the 6th of November 1997 and charged with 2 counts of capital murder. She gave a full taped confession. The trial began in June of 1998 in Pulaski County Circuit Court before Judge Marion Humphrey. The lead prosecutor was the Pulaski County prosecuting attorney, Larry Jegley. Jegley's theory of the case was a theory of inconvenience. Riggs, in his framing, had come to see her own children as obstacles to a future she wanted for herself. Her own attempt to take her life, in his framing, had been a ruse. 3 defense psychiatric experts testified against that framing to the major depression and the untreated trauma. The defense's central argument, in framing the killings as the act of a woman in major depressive psychosis, rather than a woman acting out of inconvenience, was that the suicide had been the plan. The killings had been an extension of the suicide, and the failure of the suicide had been the only reason the children had ended up the only ones who died. The jury did not accept the argument. Larry Jegley's framing, that Riggs had wanted to be free of the children, won the case. The jury returned a guilty verdict on both counts of capital murder in under an hour. On the 30th of June, 1998, the jury, of 7 women and 5 men, deliberated for 55 minutes before convicting Christina Riggs of both counts. At the penalty phase, she refused to allow her own attorneys to put on mitigating evidence. She told the jury, on the record, that she wanted to die, that she wanted to be with her babies, and that she wanted them to give her the death penalty. The jury gave her the death penalty. Formal sentence was imposed on the 1st of July, 1998. She was transferred to the McPherson unit. The McPherson Unit, the women's unit of the Arkansas Department of Correction, had not held a woman under sentence of death since the 1800s. She waived all of her appeals. Her choice to waive appeal, to refuse mitigation at her own sentencing, and to ask the state to carry out the sentence put the case on a track that, in death penalty practice, is called the volunteer track. The state of Arkansas was, in effect, being asked by the inmate to do the thing the inmate had failed to do herself. The clemency process, which under Arkansas law runs through the governor's office and is advised by the parole board, became the only legal mechanism that could have stopped the execution. Her own attorney, John Wesley Hall Jr., summarised what he believed had happened in 8 words to reporters at the time. It had started as a suicide and ended as a suicide. Then Governor Mike Huckabee denied clemency. On the 30th of April 2000, Christina Riggs was flown to the Cummins Unit, where the state of Arkansas carried out its executions. On the night of Tuesday the 2nd of May 2000, medical staff struggled for nearly 20 minutes to find a vein in her arm. They used a vein in her wrist instead. The lethal injection began at 18 minutes past 9 in the evening. Her final words, as recorded in the witnesses' chamber and confirmed in the contemporaneous reporting by CBS News, were that there were no words to express how sorry she was for taking the lives of her babies, and that there was no way she could make up for or take away the pain she had caused everyone who had ever known them. She added a sentence about being with her babies again. About a minute later, she whispered that she loved them. She was pronounced dead at 28 minutes past 9 in the evening, Central Daylight Time, on the 2nd of May 2000. Per the CBS News reporting at the time, Christina Riggs was the 5th woman put to death in the United States since the Supreme Court had lifted the ban on capital punishment in 1976. The 4 women who had preceded her on that list, in the modern era of the American death penalty, had been Velma Barfield of North Carolina, Carla Faye Tucker of Texas, Judy Bueno Año of Florida, and Betty Lou Beets of Texas. The 6th, who followed within the next year, was Wanda Jean Allen of Oklahoma. Of all 5 women on the modern American list at the time of Riggs's death, she was the only one whose case the Amnesty International briefing referred to, in shorthand, as a volunteer execution. She was the first woman the state of Arkansas had put to death in the modern era of Arkansas executions, with state corrections records confirming that no woman had been put to death by the state since the prison system had taken over executions in the early 20th century. Riggs's body was returned to Oklahoma and given to her mother, Carol Thomas. Carol Thomas was the woman who had walked into the duplex on the morning of the 5th of November 1997 and had found her own daughter unconscious on the floor and her 2 grandchildren dead on the bed. She buried Christina beside Justin and Shelby in the same Oklahoma cemetery. Amnesty International and the American Civil Liberties Union argued in the years that followed that her execution had amounted to state-assisted suicide, given that she had refused to allow her own attorneys to argue for her life. The case is, in capital punishment scholarship, the textbook example of what is called a volunteer execution. The Riggs case is the case of a single mother in Arkansas who, on her last day at her own job, took the controlled substances she had access to home with her, used them on her own 2 small children, and tried to follow them. The next case on this list is the case of a mother in St. Paul, Minnesota, who, on the 3rd of September 1998, called each of her 6 children into the family apartment, one at a time, in birth order, by telling them they were about to play a game. Case 4. Kua Her. On the afternoon of Thursday the 3rd of September 1998, in a public housing apartment in St. Paul, Minnesota, a 24-year-old mother called her 6 children into the apartment, one at a time, in birth order, by telling them they were going to play hide and seek. The oldest was 11, the youngest was 5. Within the next hour, all 6 of them were dead. The mother was wearing a red Hmong ceremonial dress. By the time the police arrived, she had wrapped an extension cord around her own neck in an attempt to take her own life. She was alive when the police entered. None of her children were. The mother's name was Kua Her. She had been born on the 31st of December 1973 in Laos. She was, by ethnicity, Hmong. Her own life, by every statement she made to investigators after the killings and to the public defender who later represented her, had been shaped by violence from the time she was a child. She had been abused at 12 in a Thai refugee camp. She had been married at 12 into a marriage arranged for her to a Hmong man named Tu Lee Hang. She had arrived in the United States with her husband as part of the Hmong refugee outflow of the late 1970s and the 1980s. The Hmong refugee outflow in the years after the Vietnam War was the resettlement to the United States of an ethnic minority from the highlands of Laos who had fought as American allies in the CIA's so-called secret war. By the late 1980s, the largest Hmong communities in the United States were in Minnesota, in California's Central Valley, and in Wisconsin. The twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, by the time Kawa He settled there with her husband, were the largest Hmong urban concentration in the country. McDonough Homes, the public housing complex she lived in, was within walking distance of much of the Hmong commercial life of the eastern side of the city. The community around her was, in absolute numbers, large. Her own family inside it, by the summer of 1998, was small. By the time she was 21 years old, she had borne 6 children to him. The family lived at the McDonough Homes public housing project in the northern part of the city of St. Paul. By the summer of 1998, the marriage had broken down. Tu Lee Hang had moved out. Kawa He was 24 years old, alone, raising 6 children in poverty, and, by the accounts of the small number of friends she had been confiding in, suicidal. St. Paul police had been called to the apartment at McDonough Homes at least 15 times in the 18 months before the killings, on calls described in the police reports as domestic disturbances. The reports from those calls, summarised by the St. Paul Pioneer Press in the days after the killings, described disputes inside the apartment that had not, in any single case, escalated into the kind of charge that takes a parent out of a home. The 15 calls were spread across the 18 months. They were filed, as a rule, late in the evening. They were closed, as a rule, without arrest. The pattern, in retrospect, was the pattern of a household in chronic crisis that the system was logging without addressing. The friend she had been talking to about her despair had not, in the days immediately before what happened, taken it as seriously as her own statement after the fact suggested she had meant it. One of the friends, who agreed to speak with the Pioneer Press on condition of anonymity, said in the week after the killings that Kawa had loved her children. She had been, on this account, crushed by the responsibility. She had also, on this account, been kept inside the apartment for years by a husband whose own violence had been documented in police reports the same 15 calls had originated from. By the summer of 1998, that husband was gone. The violence was gone with him. What remained, in the apartment Kawa He was now alone in, was the 6 children, the rent, the food, the school registrations, the medical appointments, and the weight of having been a child bride in a refugee camp who had borne 6 children before she was 21. The 6 children, all of whom carried their father's clan name of Hang, were Kawa I Hang, who was 11, Samson Hang, who was 9, Nali Hang, who was 8, Tang Lung Hang, who was 7, Ayi Hang, who was 6, and Tang Kei Hang, who was 5. On the afternoon of the 3rd of September 1998, Kawa He put on a red Hmong ceremonial dress. She walked outside the apartment building briefly in the dress. 4 of her children watched her from an upstairs window of the apartment. She walked back inside. She called the children inside one at a time, beginning with the 11-year-old, by telling each of them they were going to play hide and seek. With the same piece of black cloth she had tied around the neck of the first child, she ended the lives, one by one, in turn, of all 6. When all 6 were dead, she put the extension cord loosely around her own neck. The cord did not work. She placed a 911 call. The dispatcher's tape captured what she said. The first thing she said was that she was killing herself. Then she said that she had killed the kids and that she did not know why she had killed the kids. Police arrived at the family's apartment in the McDonough Homes complex within minutes. They found her at the doorway in the red ceremonial dress with the extension cord still around her neck. They found the 11-year-old, Kawa I Hang, at the top of the second-floor landing with the cloth still around his neck. The other 5 they found in the split-level apartment in the order their mother had called them in, oldest to youngest. The black cloth, by the medical examiner's later finding, had been the same single length of fabric throughout. There had not been 6 pieces. There had been 1 piece, used in turn, the same cloth, on each of the 6 children. That single detail, more than any other in the case file, would mark every later retelling. Kuaher was taken to Regent's Hospital. The St Paul Police Homicide Unit, under Lieutenant John Vermastek, processed the scene. There was no investigative mystery. Kuaher was held on $1 million bail. A state-ordered psychiatric evaluation found her competent to stand trial. On the 13th of November, 1998, she pleaded not guilty before Ramsey County District Judge Charles Flynn Jr. The case did not go to trial. On the 1st of December 1998, in front of the same judge, with the prosecutor Chris Wilton and the public defender Bruce Wenger at the lawyers' tables, Kuaher abruptly changed her plea. The names of all 6 of her children were read aloud, in birth order. She sobbed and answered, after each name, the same one-word answer: guilty. The sentence was 50 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 33 years served. She was sent to the Minnesota Correctional Facility at Shakopee. Her projected release date is the year 2032, at which point she will be in her late 50s. She is still incarcerated at Shakopee. The motive she gave at her plea hearing was the motive she had given the 911 dispatcher and her interrogators. She had wanted, by her own statement on the record, to take her own life first. She had not been able to imagine what would happen to her children after she was gone. Her public defender, Bruce Wenger, described to the court the overwhelming responsibility of a 24-year-old mother with 6 children in public housing, with no family support, with documented marital abuse behind her. A woman who knew her told the St Paul Pioneer Press at the time that Kuaher had loved her children but had been crushed by the responsibility. St Paul Police Chief William Finney told the same paper on the day after the killings that this kind of case was not specific to any single culture. He had seen it before, in his words, across cultures. The 6 children were buried together on the 14th of September 1998 at Forest Lawn Cemetery in nearby Maplewood, in child-sized vaults laid west to east, oldest to youngest, on Lot 134 of Block 33. For most of the next decade, the 6 graves remained unmarked. The decision to leave the graves unmarked, by the people who had been close to the children and to their father Tu Li Hang, had been a decision shaped by grief and by religious tradition. By the mid-2000s, as the children's surviving extended family aged, and as new generations of Hmong American Minnesotans came of age who had not known the family directly, the question of how the 6 children should be remembered had become, in the Hmong community of St Paul, a question of public conscience rather than of private grief. The graves were eventually marked. The marker, when it was placed, was for all 6 children at once, named in birth order, west to east, with their dates. The Hmong community in the Twin Cities led a sustained public effort to have the graves marked, which became, in the years that followed, one of several flashpoints in the visibility of the Hmong community in Minnesota's civic life. The Hmong American Partnership established a Hmong crisis hotline in the wake of the case, aimed at the family pressure scenarios that the case had brought to public attention. There was also, in the same period, a separate flashpoint in the Twin Cities media landscape that had been running alongside the Kuaher case. In June of 1998, a local FM radio morning show, the KQRS Morning Show, had broadcast a series of mocking remarks about the Hmong community that had become the subject of a sustained advertiser boycott led by Hmong community organisations. The boycott, which gained momentum across the summer and the autumn, was at its peak in the same weeks that the news of Kuaher's confession at McDonough Homes was reaching the public. The radio station's on-air apology, broadcast on the 5th of November 1998, became one marker of a moment in which the Hmong community of Minnesota had begun to insist, in public, on a different relationship with the media that covered it. The Kuaher case is the case of a young Hmong mother in St. Paul, isolated and crushed, who called her 6 children into the apartment one at a time and ended their lives in the order she had given birth to them. The next case on this list, in some ways, is the inverse. It is the case of a mother in a small South Carolina town who, on the night of the 25th of October 1994, sent her 2 small children into a lake strapped into the back seat of her car, and then told the entire country, on national television and for the next 9 days, that a stranger had taken them. 6 cases left in this one. Hit subscribe if you want them dropping into your feed when they go up. No cost, no catch. Case 5. Susan Smith. On the night of Tuesday the 25th of October 1994, in the small mill town of Union, South Carolina, a 23-year-old mother drove her own car to the boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, released the emergency brake, and let the car roll into the lake with both of her small children strapped into their car seats. She ran to a nearby house. She told the homeowners, and within the hour she would tell the country, that a young black man with a gun had carjacked her at a stoplight and taken off with her 2 sons. The national search that followed lasted 9 days. It was a hoax. The mother had killed the children herself. The mother's name was Susan Vaughn Smith. She had been born on the 26th of September 1971 in Union, South Carolina. By the autumn of 1994, she was 23 years old. Her own life, before the killings of her 2 small children, had been the kind of life that a documentary narrator could spend the first half of a film working through. Her biological father, Harry Vaughn, had taken his own life when she was 6. Her mother had remarried a prominent Union County Republican named Beverly Russell. By the time Susan was an adult, Russell would admit in his own court testimony to abuse of her that had begun when she was 15 and to a continuing relationship with her into adulthood, including in the weeks immediately before the killings. Susan had tried to take her own life at 13 and again at 18. The Russell admission of abuse, when it came years later under oath at her trial, would be one of the strangest moments in the proceedings. Beverly Russell was a prominent Republican Party figure in Union County, on the state executive committee of the South Carolina Republican Party at the time the case broke. His own testimony at the trial of the woman he had abused as a teenager and continued to have a relationship with as an adult was the kind of public document that no Southern political career in 1995 could survive. He survived it. He continued to live in Union after the verdict. He died in April of 2018. His admission of what he had done to Susan Smith, on the public record, is the only reason any of the rest of this case can be understood. By October of 1994, she was 23, separated from her husband David Smith, in divorce proceedings, and having an affair with a young man named Tom Findley. Findley was the son of Kerry Findley, who owned Conso Products Company, where Susan worked. On the 17th of October, 1994, Tom Findley sent her a written letter breaking off the affair. The letter would later be recovered by police divers. It said, in part, that there were things about her that were not suited for him, and that he was speaking specifically about her children. He did not want, in the letter's own framing, to be a father to 2 small boys who were not his. He thought the world of her, the letter said. He did not, the letter said, want what she had. The letter had been written by a young man trying to be honest. By the time it was recovered by police divers 18 days later, in the trunk of the car the children had drowned in, the letter had become the documentary heart of the prosecution's case. Her 2 children were Michael Daniel Smith, who was 3 years old, and Alexander Tyler Smith, who was 14 months old. Alex was a baby. Michael was just past toddler age. On the 25th of October 1994, Susan met Tom Findley 3 separate times. Findley later testified at her trial that she had been overwrought during all 3 of those meetings. At around 15 minutes past 9 in the evening, Susan drove her 1990 Mazda Protege to the boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, just outside the town of Union. She got out of the car. She released the emergency brake. The car rolled down the ramp into the lake, with Michael and Alex still strapped into their car seats in the back. A police recreation later established that the car took 6 minutes to sink to its final resting place, 18 feet down. Susan Smith ran from the boat ramp to the home of Shirley and Rick McLeod. She told the McLeods that a young black man had carjacked her at a stoplight in Union, that the man had had a gun, and that the man had driven off with her car and with her 2 sons inside it. The McLeods called police. Within hours, the story Susan Smith had told them was on local news. Within a day, it was on every national network. Within 3 days, the case had its own composite sketch, distributed nationally, of a young black man in a plaid jacket and a dark toboggan. The country looked for the man for 9 days. The man did not exist. The hoax cost a region. Black men in their 20s in Union County, in Spartanburg, in Greenville, in Charlotte were stopped and questioned. The story, as it ran on national television, was a story that confirmed every white fear the region had ever organised itself around. Susan Smith, on the network newscasts in those 9 days, was photographed in tears alongside her husband David Smith, asking the country to bring her children home. The country watched. The country looked for the man. The man did not exist. The story she had told the country was, by the 3rd of November, all that was holding her up. Susan Smith and her husband David Smith took FBI polygraph tests on the 27th of October. Sheriff Howard Wells, who had grown up with Susan and who had been studying her closely from the beginning, came to believe in those days that she was lying. He had reason. The detail of her story had not been consistent. The polygraph had not been clean. On the 3rd of November 1994, Sheriff Wells confronted Susan Smith at a local church in Union. She asked the sheriff to pray with her. After the prayer, she wrote a confession. Divers found her car at the boat ramp at John D. Long Lake later that day. The car was 18 feet down, upside down, near the ramp. Both children were still strapped into their car seats in the back. One of the children's hands was pressed against the window. The Mazda Protégé had come to rest upside down. The car had filled with water within a minute. The 2 children, in their car seats, had been alive in the air pocket for some part of the descent. Tom Findley's 17th of October breakup letter was recovered with the car. The letter, which Susan Smith had folded and placed in the car before she had pushed it down the ramp, was water-damaged but legible. The letter, after the bodies of the children, was the second piece of evidence the divers pulled from the trunk. The trial took place in July of 1995 before Judge William Howard at the Union County Court of General Sessions. The lead prosecutor was 16th Circuit Solicitor Tommy Pope, with Chief Deputy Kevin Brackett. Susan Smith was defended by David Bruck and Judy Clark, 2 of the most accomplished capital defense lawyers of the era. Beverly Russell, her stepfather, testified to the long-running abuse he had committed against Susan and to its recent resumption. Tom Findley testified about the breakup letter. The defense theory was that Susan had driven to the lake, intending to take her own life and the lives of her sons together, and that her body had, in the language her own defense used, willed itself out of the car at the last moment. Tommy Pope, in his closing, did not accept that. On the night of the 25th of October, he told the jury, Susan Smith had made a horrible choice. She had chosen the love of a man over the love of her 2 sons. On the 22nd of July 1995, the jury convicted her on both counts after about 2.5 hours of deliberation. After the penalty phase, the jury declined to impose the death penalty. They imposed life. On the 28th of July 1995, she was formally sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms with parole eligibility after 30 years under the South Carolina law then in effect. South Carolina changed that law in 1996 to eliminate parole for life sentences. The change was not retroactive to Susan Smith. The 30-year eligibility window, under the law in effect at the time of her conviction, was the window that gave the case its strange, long arc. The state legislature, responding directly to the Smith case and to a separate political climate around parole, removed parole eligibility from new life sentences within the year. The change, by its own terms, was not retroactive. Susan Smith's parole window remained the original window. The case, in the cultural memory, had been a settled story since 1995. The case, in the legal calendar, had not been settled at all. It had been sitting on a 30-year fuse. She became eligible for parole on the 4th of November 2024. On the 20th of November 2024, the South Carolina Probation, Parole and Pardon Services Board denied her parole. The vote, per WSPA reporting, was 5-0. David Smith, who has attended every parole hearing, told the board that God had given Susan a free choice, and she had made it. He had been 24 years old in October of 1994. He had been the father of the 2 boys his wife had killed. He had spent 30 years going to every legal proceeding the case had generated. He told the board in November of 2024 that he was still doing it because the boys had no voice of their own. Susan testified by video, sobbing that she knew what she had done was horrible and that she would give anything to be able to go back and change it. The board denied. Her next parole hearing is set for the 19th of November 2026. In August of 2025, she lost her phone, tablet and canteen privileges for 90 days after being internally charged with communicating with a documentary filmmaker who had reportedly offered to pay her to participate. Michael and Alex Smith are buried together in one casket at Bogensville United Methodist Church Cemetery in Union County. The headstone bears both names. The dates of birth are roughly 2 years apart. The date of death is the same. The case remains in the American memory the most recognised case of a mother who killed her own small children. Songs by Blind Melon, by Caroline Herring, and by half a dozen other artists across the next quarter century would name the children by name and the lake by name. It is also in the cultural memory of every black man in the Southeast who happened to be near a stoplight in the autumn of 1994, a case about the cost of being the kind of stranger a white mother could blame. The Smith case is the most recognised case on this list. The next case, 25 years later in a small Pennsylvania town 2 hours northwest of Philadelphia, is the case of a mother who tried to use a cover story even less believable than a stranger at a stoplight. Case 6. Lisa Snyder. On the afternoon of Monday the 23rd of September 2019, in a single-family home in Albany Township, Berks County, Pennsylvania, a 36-year-old mother called 911 to report that she had found her 2 children unresponsive in the basement, hanging 3 feet apart from the same plastic-coated cable dog lead wrapped around the main support beam. Her cover story was that her 8-year-old son had been bullied at school, had ended his own life, and had then ended the life of his 4-year-old sister. The 2 children were flown to a hospital. They died 3 days later. Her own Google search history would be the part of the case that nobody would believe. The mother's name was Lisa Rochelle Snyder. She had been 36 years old at the time of the killings and 41 at her conviction. She lived in a single-family home in the 2400 block of Route 143 in Albany Township, near the small town of Kempton in Berks County, Pennsylvania. She was the divorced mother of 3 children. The 2 younger children had died at her hands. The oldest, a 17-year-old son, would later testify against her at trial. The defence at trial would argue a long-term history of childhood abuse and untreated mental illness on Lisa Snyder's part. A defence psychiatrist testified that she may have been psychotic at the time of the killings, but that, in his own carefully framed words, her illness had not impaired her intent to do what she did. The prosecution's psychiatric experts disagreed with him in part and agreed with him in part. The intent was not in dispute. The 2 children, by the morning of the 23rd of September 2019, were Connor Snyder, who was 8 years old and a 3rd grader at Greenwich Lenhartsville Elementary School. The other was Brinley Snyder, who was 4. The 2 of them shared a bedroom on the upper floor of the Albany Township house. The 17-year-old half-brother had his own room and his own life, and was not in the house at the relevant times that afternoon. What the prosecution would eventually be able to put on the record, through the Pennsylvania State Police investigators and the digital forensics team that analysed the contents of the cellular devices recovered from the Snyder home in early October of that year, was a written record of premeditation that ran across the entire week before the killings. Across the week before the killings, Lisa Snyder had typed into Google the phrase about how long it takes to die of carbon monoxide poisoning in a car. In the same week, she had searched for the best episodes of a true crime show called I Almost Got Away With It. The night before the killings, she had ordered a plastic-coated cable dog lead from a Walmart online listing, and on the same evening, she had searched the term hanging yourself. On the morning of the 23rd of September, the day she made the 911 call, she had driven to a nearby Walmart and had picked up the lead she had ordered. Then, around the middle of the day, she had searched whether a hybrid car produces carbon monoxide while idling. That afternoon, The school bus pulled up at its stop near the Snyder house at the time it always did. The bus's onboard security camera captured Connor Snyder getting off the bus and running toward the house in the way an 8-year-old runs at the end of a school day. He was not, on that recorded footage, in any kind of visible distress. Lisa Snyder later said that, after the children had got home, she had taken them down to the basement of the house, and that Connor had asked her, in her own framing of it later, if they could build a fort down there. She made the 911 call at around 4 in the afternoon. She told the dispatcher that she had found her 2 children in the basement. She told the dispatcher that Connor had been bullied at school for months. She told the dispatcher that Connor, having reached the point of no return, had ended his own life on the support beam and had ended the life of his 4-year-old sister Brinley first, so that she would not have to grow up without him. 2 kitchen chairs from the upstairs of the house had been brought down to the basement and were tipped over near the support beam. The plastic-coated cable dog lead Lisa Snyder had picked up that morning was the cable from which her 2 children were found. Both children were flown by helicopter to Lehigh Valley Hospital, Cedar Crest, near Allentown, and placed on life support. Connor and Brinley Snyder were taken off life support on the 26th of September 2019 and died. The story Lisa Snyder had given the dispatcher began to come apart inside the first 48 hours. The principal at Greenwich Lenhartsville Elementary said the school had no record of Connor being bullied. His teachers said the same. His half-brother said the same. The school bus security video showed him cheerful, not despondent. An occupational therapist, later called by the prosecution, would testify that an 8-year-old of Connor Snyder's height and build was not physically capable of producing the hanging configuration in which he was found. The 2 chairs near the support beam, in this expert's testimony, would not have been usable by him in the configuration the cover story required. The Lehigh County Coroner's Office ruled both deaths homicides by hanging. The prosecution's theory of the second killing, the killing of 4-year-old Brinley, was that Brinley had walked in on her mother while her mother was killing her brother, and that the mother had then killed her too. Berks County District Attorney John T. Adams told the press at one of the early hearings what he believed had happened. He said, in his own words at a later press conference, that Lisa Snyder had told a friend that she had simply had enough. The most damning evidence at trial was not, in the end, that statement, it was the search history. Pennsylvania State Police investigators executed search warrants on the Snyder home on the 4th of October 2019. They recovered several cellular devices. The forensic phone exam was conducted by the Berks County District Attorney's Office Digital Forensics Team in coordination with the state police's own cyber unit. The phones had not been wiped. The browser histories on at least 2 of them were intact across the entire month of September. The carbon monoxide query, the Walmart purchase, the cable lead delivery confirmation, and the hanging yourself search all appeared on the same device in the same week. The yield, in the language used by the prosecution at the bench trial 5 years later, was the great deal of other digital material recovered from the same phones, some of which related to additional charges Lisa Snyder would face from material found on the devices that did not bear on the children's deaths, but that the prosecution was permitted to introduce at trial. Snyder was arrested on the 2nd of December 2019 on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of endangering the welfare of children, and 1 count of tampering with evidence. She remained in custody. The case took 5 years to reach trial. In 2023, she sought to plead no contest but mentally ill to 2 counts of third-degree murder. Berks County President Judge M. Teresa Johnson rejected the plea agreement, saying, in her order, that it did not serve the interests of justice. Snyder then waived her right to a jury trial and elected a bench trial in front of Judge Johnson. The bench trial began on the 16th of September 2024. The prosecution put on roughly 8 days of testimony. At the end of those 8 days, Judge Johnson took approximately 1 hour to deliberate. On the 24th of September 2024, she convicted Lisa Snyder on every count. On the 17th of October 2024, Judge Johnson sentenced Snyder to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 8.5 to 17 years on the child endangerment and evidence tampering counts. Per Associated Press, reporting carried by NBC News at the time, Judge Johnson, who had then served on the Berks County bench for years, called the killing the most violent killing she had seen in her time as a judge. She said that the defendant had never shown any remorse. She added, in extended courtroom comment, preserved by Berks County reporting, that the fact that one person could put their hands directly on another to end that person's life made the act, in her words, that much worse than if the defendant had stood across the street and used a firearm. Lisa Snyder declined to address the court at sentencing. She had been silent through most of the bench trial. She had been silent through the sentencing hearing itself. She had also, on Judge Johnson's own finding, read from the bench, shown no remorse at any point in the proceedings. Her 17-year-old son did address the court. He had been the one who had stood with the rest of the family on the side of the prosecution. He told the court that if he could turn back time, he would, just to hear his half-brother and half-sister's voices again. The courtroom was, by the reporting of the Reading Eagle that day, completely silent for the duration of his statement. The case became, in the months that followed, a small but durable case in the Pennsylvania legal commentary about online search records as evidence and about the credibility of the cover stories adults are willing to put on a child too young to refute them. The Berks County District Attorney's Office published a short policy guide in the year that followed about the use of browser history evidence in domestic homicide cases. The Lisa Snyder bench trial is one of the cases the guide cites by name. District Attorney Adams, asked at the post-sentencing press conference what he wanted the public to remember about the case, gave an answer of one sentence. 8-year-olds, in his words, generally do not end their own lives. Connor Snyder, by the school's records, had not been a child who anyone close to him had thought of in those terms. The Snyder case is the case of a mother who, on a Monday afternoon in the autumn of 2019, killed her 2 small children in the basement of their own home and tried to pin the killing on a story about bullying that the school's own records would not support. The next case on this list moves the geography out of the United States entirely. It is the case of a New Zealand mother who, after killing her own 2 small children with a prescription antidepressant dissolved into juice, packed their bodies into 2 suitcases, stored them in a rental locker in South Auckland, and flew to South Korea under a new name. The bodies sat in the locker for 4 years before a family bidding on the contents of the locker at auction opened the first of the 2 suitcases in their own front yard. 4 cases left in this one. If true crime breakdowns like this are why you came here, subscribe so the next investigation finds you when it lands. Case 7. Ha-Kyung Lee. In June of 2018, in a home in the South Auckland suburb of Papatoetoe, New Zealand, a mother dissolved her own prescribed antidepressant into a pitcher of fruit juice and gave it to her 2 small children. The children, an 8-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son, drank the juice and walked to their bedrooms. They did not wake again. 4 years later, in August of 2022, a family who had won the contents of an auctioned-off storage locker in South Auckland opened the first of 2 suitcases in their own front yard. Inside the first suitcase, they found a child. Inside the second one, they found the other. The mother's name by the time of her trial was Ha-Kyung Lee. She had been born in South Korea under the name Ji-Eun Lee. She had moved with her family to New Zealand and become a New Zealand citizen years earlier. By the time of the killings, she was in her late 30s, living with her 2 children in the home she had shared with her husband. The husband had died of cancer in 2017. He had been ill for some time. His death had been, by the testimony of a palliative care counsellor read at the trial, a death he and his wife had spoken about in advance, with what seemed to the counsellor at the time to be a darker undertone than the counsellor had been able to act on. The wife, the counsellor said, had told her that she wanted it all to be over. She had spoken of ending both her own and her husband's lives. After the husband's death, the mental health of his widow deteriorated. She raised her 2 children alone. She continued to be prescribed nortriptyline, a tricyclic antidepressant that is not approved in New Zealand for use in children. By the late spring of 2018, Yuna Jo was 8 years old and Minu Jo was 6. The 2 children were active. The neighbours in Papatoetoe described them, in the news interviews that ran in late 2022, as the kind of children who were always outside. The killings, by the Crown's case, took place across a window of 4 days in late June of 2018. The formal charging period set by the Crown ran from the 23rd of June to the 27th of July. The Crown's case at trial centred on Wednesday the 27th of June as the most likely day of death. The mother's own account, given through her self-representation at the eventual trial and through her sole defence witness, the forensic psychiatrist Dr. Kelly, was that she had dissolved the nortriptyline into a pitcher of fruit juice and had given it to her 2 children. The children had drunk the juice. They had walked to their bedrooms. The dosage was a dosage prepared for 2 small bodies and intended to be fatal. The mother had then prepared what she believed would be a fatal dosage of the same drug for herself. She had taken the dosage. She had woken up the next morning. Her 2 children, in their bedrooms, were dead. She had attempted, on her own account, to take her own life a second time with what remained of the medication. She had woken up again. What happened over the next 48 hours on the same account was a sequence the New Zealand police would only fully document 4 years later. She wrapped her 2 children, by her own description, in plastic. She packed each child into a suitcase. She moved the 2 suitcases out of the Papatoetoe home. She rented a storage locker in a South Auckland self-storage facility. She moved the suitcases into the locker. She paid the storage fees. She legally changed her name from Ji-yoon Lee to Hak-young Lee. She flew, on her new passport, from Auckland to Seoul, South Korea. She did not return. For the next 4 years, the locker in South Auckland sat untouched. The storage fees were paid by automatic deduction from a New Zealand bank account that the new Hak-young Lee maintained from Korea. The account had been opened in the new name. The payments cleared, month after month, through the rest of 2018, through all of 2019, through the pandemic year of 2020, through 2021, and into the start of 2022. By the spring of 2022, the financial circumstances of the woman in Ulsan changed. The account in New Zealand ran out. The deductions stopped. The facility's policy, when a renter falls behind, is to give notice and then to auction the contents of the locker to the highest bidder online. The auction took place in August of 2022 on the Trade Me platform, the New Zealand equivalent of an online estate sale marketplace. The winning bid, at a final price of several hundred New Zealand dollars, was placed by a family in the South Auckland suburb of Clendon Park. On the 11th of August 2022, the family who had won the locker drove the contents back to their own home in Clendon Park. They opened the first of the 2 suitcases in the front yard of the house. The smell, in the language they later used with the New Zealand Herald, had told them what they were going to find before they had got the suitcase fully open. They called the New Zealand police. The county's Manukau Criminal Investigation Branch, under Detective Inspector Tofilau Whāmanuia Vaialua, took over. The remains of the children were identified through dental records and through DNA. The case was, at the moment of the identifications, a 4-year-old cold case nobody had known was a case. The storage facility records gave the police the renter's name. The renter's name, and the legal name change behind it, led them, through Interpol, to a woman in Ulsan, South Korea, who had been receiving psychiatric care under the name Hak-young Lee. In September of 2022, Korean police took Hak-young Lee into custody in Ulsan. She had been living in an apartment in the city. She had been, by her own subsequent statements through Dr. Kelly, in psychiatric care under her new name for several months. Her detention in Korea was held quiet for several weeks, while extradition arrangements were finalised between the New Zealand police and the Korean National Police Agency in Ulsan, working through Interpol. She fought, briefly, a Korean court battle to keep her own name suppressed from publication. She lost. Her name and her photograph became public in New Zealand in late 2022, more than 4 years after she had left the country. On the 30th of November of that same year, she was extradited from Seoul to Auckland and appeared in the Manukau District Court. She was held in custody from that point through the trial. Her trial did not begin for nearly 3 more years. The case was complex. The 4-year delay between the deaths and the discovery had degraded much of the forensic evidence that would normally have been available in a fresh homicide investigation. The post-mortem examinations had to be carried out on remains that had been in suitcases in a locker through 4 New Zealand winters. The forensic cause of death was, on the eventual finding of the post-mortem pathologist Dr. Simon Stables, indeterminate. The pathologist could not, in his own carefully worded summary, rule out suffocation, ligature, drowning, or head injury as additional or alternative causes of death, alongside the documented presence of the nortriptyline in the children's remains. The Crown's case rested on the nortriptyline, on the storage timeline, on the legal name change, on the flight to Korea, and on Ha-Kyung Lee's own statements about what she had done. Together, those elements, in the Crown's framing, told a single coherent story that the jury would have to accept or reject as a whole. The trial began on the 8th of September 2025 at the High Court at Auckland before Justice Geoffrey Venning. Ha-Kyung Lee represented herself, with standby counsel Lorraine Smith and Chris Wilkinson Smith available to her. The Crown prosecutor was Natalie Walker. Lee declined to enter a plea. The court recorded a not guilty plea on her behalf. Her defence was that she had been legally insane at the time of the killings. Her sole defence witness was the forensic psychiatrist Dr. Kelly, who had examined her over the course of her extradition and detention. Dr. Kelly testified that she had been suicidal and depressed, and that, on her account to him, she had come to believe that the killing of her children had been the right thing to do. She had told him that the deaths of the children had been, in her words to him, more of an afterthought to her own suicidal plan. She had thought, by that account, that it would be more cruel to leave them behind. The trial lasted about 2 weeks. On the 23rd of September 2025, the jury rejected the insanity defence and convicted Ha-Kyung Lee on both counts. On the 26th of November 2025, Justice Venning imposed a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. He told her, in his sentencing remarks, that her actions had been deliberate and calculated. He found, on the record, that the children had been particularly vulnerable. Under New Zealand's Mental Health Act, Lee would begin the sentence in a locked psychiatric facility and would return to prison in the court's framing when she was well enough. Lee's own mother, Choon Ja Lee, gave a statement to the court that was read aloud at sentencing. She asked, in writing, why her daughter had not, if she wanted to die, died alone. She asked why her daughter had taken the innocent children with her. She described the pain of her own grief in physical terms. She said it felt, in the wording her statement used as translated for the court, as if someone were gouging out her chest. Lee's brother-in-law, the brother of her late husband, also addressed the court. He told Justice Venning that the children's other grandmother, who was at that point sick with cancer in South Korea, had still not been told what had happened to her grandchildren. He described his own daily existence, in his own words, as a time bomb of fear that she would find out. The Lee case is the case of a New Zealand mother who, having lost her husband to cancer, killed her own 2 small children with a prescription antidepressant dissolved into juice, stored the 2 of them in suitcases inside a paid storage locker for 4 years, and lived under a new name in South Korea until a family bidding on the contents of the locker at auction opened one of the suitcases in their own front yard. The next case on this list moves back across the Pacific. It is the case of a former United States Army linguist in Tampa, Florida, whose own husband was on a deployment in the Middle East, whose own son was at soccer practice, and whose own daughter was at her bedroom computer doing her homework. On the afternoon her mother decided to kill her with a .38 caliber revolver she had bought from a gun store some distance from the house. Case 8. Julie Schenecker. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 27th of January 2011, in the Tampa Palms neighborhood of Tampa, Florida, a 50-year-old former United States Army linguist picked up her 13-year-old son from soccer practice. Her 16-year-old daughter was at home, doing her homework on her bedroom computer. By that evening, both of her children were dead. The mother had bought the revolver 2 weeks earlier from a gun store. She had written, in a journal in the master bedroom, her plan to kill the children and to kill herself. Her husband was on deployment in the Middle East. He learned about it from a call to his unit. The mother's name was Julie Powers Schenecker. She had been born in Muscatine, Iowa in 1961. She was a former United States Army Russian linguist. She had met her husband, then United States Army Colonel Parker Schenecker, in Germany in the 1980s. By the start of 2011, the Schenecker family was living in Tampa Palms, a planned community in the new Tampa area of North Tampa, Florida. The family had 2 children. Julie had a long, documented history of bipolar disorder, severe depression, and psychotic episodes that had been treated, on and off, with mixed compliance for most of her adult life. The criminal trial that would eventually follow the killings would feature testimony from 6 mental health experts. All 6 agreed she had been mentally ill at the time of the killings. 3 of those experts, called by the prosecution, would tell the jury that the illness had not made her legally insane under Florida's restrictive statutory test. There had been warning signs. The pattern of psychiatric crisis in the Schkeneker household had been documented in the family's own medical records for years. By 2010, Calix was old enough to be aware of it. On the 2nd of November 2010, 2 months before the killings, Julie had hit her 16-year-old daughter Calix hard enough that the teenager had reported it directly to her own therapist. The therapist, following Florida's mandatory reporting requirements for therapists who suspect abuse of a minor, had reported it forward to Tampa police. On the 6th of November, Tampa police visited the Schkeneker home and spoke with Julie. She acknowledged hitting the teenager. The police report logged the incident. No charges were filed. The decision not to file, in the Tampa police framework at the time, rested on the determination that the incident did not meet the threshold for a formal abuse case. The fact that the threshold had not been crossed in November did not, in retrospect, mean that the household was safe. The household was not safe. The household had 83 days left. The 2 children were Calix Powers Schkeneker, who was 16 years old, a high school junior and a distance runner, and Bo Powers Schkeneker, who was 13, a soccer player and a middle schooler. They were Julie and Parker's only 2 children. They had been raised between United States Army postings on 3 continents and were, by the spring of 2010, settled in Tampa for what was expected to be the remainder of Parker's career. In the first weeks of January 2011, Julie drove a route she had not driven before. She went to a gun store some distance from the Schkeneker house. She bought a .38 caliber revolver. She bought, with the revolver, the type of bullets that are designed to expand on impact rather than to pass through. She kept the revolver in the master bedroom of the house. She also kept, in the master bedroom, a journal that she had been writing in for some time. The journal would eventually be recovered from the same room by Tampa police on the 28th of January. Inside the journal, in her own handwriting, was the plan. The plan was the plan that would later be entered as state's evidence in the trial. She would end her children's lives. She would end her own life. She wanted, in the journal, for all 3 of them to be cremated together rather than buried separately. The journal entries were dated. They covered the weeks running up to the killings. They described her growing despair about the marriage, about her daughter's adolescent independence, about her son's separate life on the soccer field, and about her own deteriorating sense of what she could control inside her own house. They described the gun store run. They did not, on the prosecution's reading of them at trial, describe a woman who did not know what she was doing. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 27th of January 2011, Julie picked Bo up from soccer practice in the family vehicle. The drive home took her past the freeway. While the car was still in motion, she ended the 13-year-old's life with the revolver she had bought weeks earlier. She drove home. She parked the vehicle in the garage. She left her son in the back seat. She walked through the house and into Calix's bedroom. Calix was at her computer. Julie ended her daughter's life in the chair, at the computer, where her daughter had been writing the homework. She covered each of her 2 children with a blanket. The plan to take her own life had not happened. Julie had taken too many pills and had drunk alcohol with them. She had blacked out before she could use the revolver on herself. She was on the rear porch of the house when the next day, Tampa police officers, dispatched on a welfare check after Julie's own mother had been unable to reach her, came through the front door. The welfare check was the second 911 Bo and Calix's grandmother had placed in 2 days. The first had not gone through, the second one had. The officers who walked through the house on the morning of the 28th of January found Bo in the family vehicle in the garage. They found Calix in her bedroom at her computer. They found Julie, alive but heavily medicated, on the porch. They found the revolver. They found the journal. Julie Schkeneker was taken to Tampa General Hospital briefly to stabilize the overdose. She was released on the 30th of January 2011 into the custody of the Hillsborough County Jail. She told the officers who interviewed her, by her own statements to investigators, that she had killed her children because, in her words, They had talked back and they had been mouthy. She was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder on the 9th of February 2011 by a Hillsborough County grand jury. She entered a not guilty plea by reason of insanity on the 16th of February. The trial began on the 28th of April 2014 in the Hillsborough County Circuit Court before Judge Emmett Lamar Battles. The lead prosecutor was Assistant State Attorney Jay Pruner. The lead defense attorney was Assistant Public Defender Jennifer Spradley. The state of Florida, after consultation with Parker Shenecker, had waived the death penalty in advance of trial. The trial ran approximately 3 weeks. Pruner's framing of the case was a framing of premeditation. Julie Shenecker, in his closing, had been desperate, depressed, and angry, but she had also been, in his words, very determined. The killings had been, on his account, deliberate, well-planned, well-implemented, and well-concealed. He pointed the jury at the journal. He pointed the jury at the long drive to the gun store. He pointed the jury at the 2 weeks she had spent in possession of the revolver before she used it. Spradley's framing of the case was a framing of bipolar illness. A healthy version of Julie Shenecker, in her closing, would never have ended her children's lives. The version that had been at the wheel that January, by her account, had been in the claws of an untreated mental illness that the state of Florida had failed for years to manage. Spradley walked the jury through the medical records the defense had subpoenaed. She walked them through the psychiatric admissions. She walked them through the medication compliance history. The jury had to choose between 2 frames of the same set of facts. The jury chose Pruner's. On the 15th of May 2014, the jury, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, convicted Julie Shenecker on both counts of first-degree murder. The jury, by accounts later given to reporters, had reached its verdict with little dissent. Julie Shenecker addressed the court only once across the entire trial. The only sentence the public ever heard her say, in her own voice, was an apology. She apologised for what had happened. Judge Battles, the same day, sentenced her to 2 life sentences without parole to run concurrently. In February of 2023, Hillsborough Circuit Judge Michelle Sisko denied her motion for a new trial. The motion had argued that the trial-level defence had failed to put on adequate mental health evidence. The court disagreed. The defence at trial had put on 6 independent psychiatric experts. Julie Shenecker remains incarcerated in the Florida Department of Corrections on what is now a sentence with no further legal opening. Parker Shenecker filed for divorce in May of 2011, 4 months after the killings. He had been on deployment in the Middle East when the call from his unit reached him. He flew back. The trial took 3 more years to reach a verdict. He attended every day of it. He sat in the front row of the gallery for the testimony of every prosecution witness. He sat through Calix's autopsy testimony. He sat through Bo's. He sat through the journal entries being read into the record. After the verdict in 2014, he made one statement to the press. He said that the decision the jury had returned that day was, for many reasons, a great relief to him and to the families on both sides. He said that his priority, throughout the trial and throughout the years it had taken to get there, had been to give voice to his smart, beautiful, loved, and missed daughter and son. He kept, after the trial, the Shenecker name. He has since spoken publicly only sparingly. The case continues to be cited in Florida psychiatric and legal literature about the state's restrictive insanity defense statute and about the threshold the state of Florida has set for excluding a defendant who, by 6 independent psychiatric examinations, had been mentally ill at the time of the act. The Shenecker case is the case of a mother whose own untreated bipolar illness had been logged in the family's medical records and in Tampa police reports for months before the killings, and who, between those documented warning signs and the moments her own husband took the call about it on a deployment in the Middle East, had nonetheless been able to drive to a gun store, buy the revolver, write the plan in a notebook, and execute it on a Thursday afternoon. The next case on this list moves to Colorado, and to a mother who used no revolver at all. She used a pillow, and she used it on the morning her custody hearing was scheduled to begin. 2 cases to go. If the work on this channel matters to you, the subscribe button is free, and it is the thing that keeps these running. Case 9. Kelly Murphy. On the morning of Monday the 23rd of May 2011, in the small Founders Village subdivision of Castle Rock, Colorado, a 41-year-old mother called 911 and told the dispatcher that she had cut her own wrists. When the dispatcher asked her about her 2 children, a 9-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter, she answered that they were already in heaven. She refused to say any more without an attorney. The mother had been due in family court that morning for a temporary orders custody hearing. The hearing had been set for 9 o'clock. She had taken care of the children before the hearing could take place. The mother's name was Kelly Lynn Murphy. She had been 41 years old at the time of the killings and 43 at her conviction. She lived in a single-family home on Cherry Street in the Founders Village subdivision of Castle Rock, Douglas County, Colorado, about 30 miles south of Denver. She had been married to a man named Eric Murphy. The two of them had lived together at the Cherry Street house in Founders Village since the children had been born. By the spring of 2011, the Murphys were in a divorce that had moved, by all accounts of the people who had to be in the same room with them, from contentious to publicly hostile. The divorce filings on both sides had been more aggressive than the average Douglas County divorce. Kelly's position, in the public record of those filings, was that she should have 100% of the children and 100% of her husband's salary. Eric's position was that he should have joint custody and a normal split of the assets. The court was, by mid-May of 2011, leaning toward Eric's framing. Kelly, by the testimony of the people who had been close to her in those weeks, was not adjusting. The fight had moved into custody. On the 22nd of May 2011, the day before the killings, a Douglas County family court judge had granted Eric Murphy a temporary order for 50-50 joint custody. The two parents had been due back in court on the morning of the 23rd of May for the next temporary orders hearing. Kelly Murphy had no prior criminal record. The 2 children, by the late spring of 2011, were Liam Murphy, who was 9 years old and a 3rd grader at Rock Ridge Elementary School in Castle Rock, and Madigan Murphy, who was 6 years old and a kindergartner at the same school. The day after the killings would have been the last day of school. The 2 of them had been due to attend their end-of-year parties. At 48 minutes past 7 on the morning of the 23rd of May, Kelly Murphy placed a 911 call. The dispatcher's tape captured what she said. She told the dispatcher that she had cut her wrists. When the dispatcher asked her where the children were, she answered that they were in heaven already. The dispatcher pressed. Kelly Murphy did not answer further questions. She repeated throughout the call that she wanted an attorney. At around 8 o'clock, Castle Rock police arrived at the Cherry Street house. The lead officers on scene were detectives from the Castle Rock Police Department, with the Douglas County Sheriff's Office providing additional support, and the 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office investigators arriving within the hour. Madigan, the 6-year-old, was on her bed in her bedroom, face down, with her arms above her head. Liam, the 9-year-old, was on his bed in his bedroom, face up, with his arms folded across his chest. Both children were in pyjamas. Neither child had visible injuries. The 2 bedrooms were across the same upstairs hall from each other. The covers had been pulled up on both beds in the same way a mother tucks small children in. Kelly Murphy was alive in the kitchen with non-life-threatening cuts on her wrists. The cuts had not been deep. She was taken by ambulance to Sky Ridge Medical Center in nearby Lone Tree for treatment of the wrist wounds and for psychiatric evaluation. She was kept overnight. On the morning of the 24th of May, Kelly Murphy made her first court appearance before Douglas County District Judge Vincent White. She was held without bond. The autopsy, performed in the days that followed, found no visible cause of death on either child. The toxicology that came back from the children's tissues showed only one substance present. The substance was the over-the-counter antihistamine, Benadryl. The Benadryl finding became the centre of the case. Kelly Murphy's defence in the years that followed would be that she had planned to take her own life and the lives of her children together, that she had drunk vodka and taken sleeping pills, that she had blacked out, and that she had woken to find the children dead and not been able to remember what had happened. The toxicology rebutted that account. There was no vodka in the children's bodies, there were no sleeping pills, there was only the Benadryl in measurable quantities in both children. The cause of death, on the autopsy and on the testimony of the medical examiner at trial, was sustained smothering after the children had been sedated. Senior Chief Deputy District Attorney Jay Williford of the 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office in Colorado would later, at trial, give the jury the most quoted single sentence of the entire proceeding. He told the jury that what Kelly Murphy's defense was asking them to accept was, in his own words, a homicidal blackout. He called it, in shorthand for the jury, a magical blackout. He told the jurors that this was a case about control. Kelly Murphy, on his framing, had been bent on control over her children and over her marriage. She had said in the divorce filings that she had wanted 100% of the children and 100% of her husband's salary. The morning of the 23rd of May had been the morning on which she had decided that no compromise on either of those numbers was going to be accepted. The investigators also recovered from inside the house the documents that supported that framing. Eric Murphy's divorce attorney had sent Kelly Murphy a letter the previous Friday confirming the 50-50 temporary order. The letter had been found discarded inside the house. The divorce paperwork itself had been laid out on the kitchen table. A small video camera had been set up in the home in a way that the prosecution and the defense disagreed on the purpose of. The 911 call was played at trial. Eric Murphy was called as a witness. He left the witness stand after his own testimony visibly shaking. He walked into the hallway outside the courtroom and vomited into a courthouse trash can. The trial took place in Douglas County District Court before Judge Vincent White, the same judge who had held the initial appearance a year and a half earlier. The lead prosecutor was Senior Chief Deputy District Attorney Jay Williford of the 18th Judicial District Attorney's Office. The defense attorney was Ara Ohanian. The lead Castle Rock police investigators gave key testimony on the toxicology gap. The medical examiner gave the autopsy results. The defense theory was that Kelly Murphy had planned a triple ending of her own life and the lives of her children, and that the failure of her own attempt had been the only reason the case had become a homicide case, rather than what the defense framed as a tragedy. The prosecution rebutted the defense theory on the toxicology. There had been no vodka in the autopsies, there had been no sleeping pills, there had only been the Benadryl. The Benadryl had been in the children, not in Kelly. The Benadryl had been measured in the dosage of a child being put to sleep, not in the dosage of an adult ending her own life. The jury was sworn in for the trial. The defense asked the jury to convict on reckless manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. On the 27th of November 2012, after about 1 hour of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict of guilty on 2 counts each of first-degree murder and first-degree murder by a person in a position of trust. The day the verdict was returned was the day that would have been Liam Murphy's 11th birthday. Judge White, the same day, sentenced Kelly Murphy to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. There would be no probation. There would be no opportunity for early release. Castle Rock Police Chief Tony Lane told the press outside the courthouse that justice had been served for the 2 children. He named both of them at the podium. Kelly Murphy is incarcerated in the Colorado Department of Corrections. She has not, in the years since, made a public statement of any kind that has reached the Colorado press. The Colorado Department of Corrections does not, in its standard practice, make inmates serving consecutive life sentences available for press interviews. No public statement has been requested by any documentary or news organisation that has been granted. The case has not become, in the years since, the kind of cultural artefact some maternal filicide cases become. The Cherry Street house was sold. The Founders Village neighbourhood moved on. The 2 children's elementary school renamed the end-of-year party to honour them. The Liam and Madigan parental alienation legal commentary in Colorado that began after the verdict moved into the area of what one Denver Post columnist at the time called the most extreme form of spousal revenge filicide on record in the state. The trial date itself became one of the most cited dates in Colorado custody court training programs for the years that followed. Eric Murphy's family released a statement after the verdict, thanking the jury, the prosecutors, and the investigators, and acknowledging that nothing the legal system could do would fill the absence of Liam and Madigan from the lives of the people who had loved them. Eric Murphy, in the years since, has continued to live in the Castle Rock area. He has spoken in public only rarely. The Cherry Street house was sold within a year of the verdict, and was bought by a family who had not, at the time of the purchase, known what had happened in it. Liam and Madigan are buried side by side in a Castle Rock cemetery. The headstones list the same date of death. Liam's headstone would later add a small inscription, noting that the verdict that confirmed his death as a homicide had been returned on what would have been his 11th birthday. The Murphy case is the case of a mother who, on the morning her custody hearing was set to take place, ended the lives of her two small children rather than share them with their father. The next case on this list is, in its scale and in its time signature, the longest single case on this list. It is a case in which a mother in a small Ohio town ended the lives of 3 of her children, one at a time, across 13 months, in the same apartment, by the same method, before the third death finally led the police back to the first 2. Case 10. Brittany Pilkington. Between July of 2014 and August of 2015, in a small apartment in Bellefontaine, Logan County, Ohio, 3 of the 4 children born to a 22-year-old mother and her much older husband died, one at a time. The first was 3 months old, the second was 4 years old, the third was 3 months old. All 3 were boys. The deaths of the first 2 were initially ruled medically inconclusive. The death of the third was the one that brought the Bellefontaine Police Department to the hospital on the morning of the 18th of August 2015. Inside of 10 hours, the mother had confessed to all 3. The mother's name was Brittany Pilkington. She had been 23 at her arrest and 27 at her sentencing 4 years later. To explain what had brought her into the grieving room of the Mary Rutan Hospital that morning is to walk back through a life that had been, by every record that came out at her trial, one of sustained childhood abuse and untreated brain injury. Her own father had beaten her as a child. The man who would eventually become her husband, Joseph Pilkington, had been more than 20 years older than her. He had been her own mother Laurie Cummins's boyfriend, living in the same household with the family when Brittany was about 9. By the time Brittany was a teenager, the same man who had moved into her childhood home as her mother's partner had begun to abuse her. By her own sworn court testimony at her sentencing, the abuse had been recurrent and had begun when she was about 12 years old. She had also, by the same testimony, suffered brain damage as a child from lead poisoning in the housing she had been raised in. In 2009, Joseph Pilkington, then living with Brittany's mother, fathered a daughter with the 17-year-old Brittany. The daughter, Haley, was born that year. Joseph and Brittany later married. Joseph was originally charged, after a separate investigation, with sexual battery for what he had done to her over the years she had been a minor. He pleaded down in July of 2016 to a single count of misdemeanor sexual imposition. He registered as a sex offender annually for 15 years. He served no jail time. By 2014, the Pilkington household at the small apartment in Bellefontaine was Joseph, Brittany, their surviving daughter Haley, and a series of infant sons. The first to die was Niall Pilkington, who was 3 months old. He died on the 22nd of July, 2014. The cause of death, on the initial finding, was medically inconclusive. Brittany told investigators at the time that she had rolled over onto him in her sleep. The second to die was Gavin Pilkington, who was 4 years old. He died on the 6th of April 2015. The cause of death, on the initial finding, was medically undetermined. The Logan County Children's Services Agency took custody of the surviving newborn, Noah, and of 7-year-old Haley in the weeks after Gavin's death. On the 12th of August 2015, 6 days before the third death, Logan County Family Court Judge Dan Bratka found that the evidence available to him at that point did not justify keeping the children out of their parents' care. He returned Noah and Haley to the Pilkington household. The third to die was Noah Pilkington. He died on the 18th of August 2015, 6 days after he had been returned to his parents. He was 3 months old. At approximately 3 o'clock that morning, Brittany Pilkington called 911. Noah was unresponsive. Noah was pronounced dead at the Mary Rutan Hospital in Bellefontaine. Then Logan County Prosecutor William Gosley, addressing the press in the hours after Noah's death, gave the single sentence that broke the silence on the first 2 deaths. 6 days before Noah's death, in Gosley's framing, a family court judge had returned Noah and his sister to the same family. At around 6 o'clock that morning, a Bellefontaine police detective approached Brittany Pilkington in the hospital's grieving room. He brought her to the Bellefontaine Police Department and to the Logan County Sheriff's Office. Across approximately 10 hours of taped interview, Brittany Pilkington confessed to ending the lives of all 3 of her sons. She had ended each life, on her own taped account, by placing the boy's own blanket over his head and holding it there. The first one had been Niall in July of 2014. The second had been Gavin in April of 2015. The third had been Noah in August of 2015. The motive she gave was a motive of jealousy. She had been jealous, on her account, of the attention her husband Joseph paid to their infant sons. She had also, on her account, feared what the boys would grow up to be. The man who had abused her since she was 12 was the same man whose attention to the sons she had borne him had become, in her own framing on the tape, unbearable. Per the suppression hearing audio of her 2016 interview, later reported by the Washington Post, she had also told the investigators that she had not, in her own words, wanted to see the boys suffer. She was arraigned on the 20th of August 2015 on 3 counts of aggravated murder. In 2016, the trial judge granted a defense motion to suppress the portion of her confession that related to Niall, the first child. The case dragged through the next 3 years. The death penalty, which the state of Ohio had originally placed on the table, was eventually withdrawn after a state psychiatric expert testified that Brittany Pilkington's brain damage and the documented history of her own childhood abuse made the death penalty an inappropriate outcome. On the 19th of November 2019, in the Logan County Court of Common Pleas, before visiting Judge Mark S. O'Connor, Brittany Pilkington pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder for Gavin and for Noah, and to 1 count of involuntary manslaughter for Niall. The lead prosecutor was Eric Stewart of the Logan County Prosecutor's Office, with the Ohio Attorney General's Special Prosecutions Section as co-counsel. The lead defense attorney was Court W. Gatterdam, with Mark S. Triplett and Tina McFall as co-counsel. Judge O'Connor sentenced Brittany the same day. She received 15 years to life on each murder count, to run consecutively, and 7 years on the involuntary manslaughter count. The total sentence was 37 years to life. The death penalty had originally been on the table when the state of Ohio filed the indictment in 2015. The state psychiatric expert who examined Brittany in the 4 years between indictment and plea had testified on the record that she met the criteria the Ohio statute uses for excluding the death penalty in cases of severe cognitive impairment. The plea agreement that resulted from that finding took the death penalty off the table in exchange for the murder pleas on Gavin and Noah and the involuntary manslaughter plea on Niall. Prosecutor Stewart told reporters outside the courthouse that the sentence would bring justice and closure to the case and would protect the community from the defendant for the period required. Defense lead Court Gatterdam, at his client's sentencing, said in court that Brittany's brain was, in his own words, broken. He said that no one had ever helped her. He cited the childhood lead poisoning, the years of abuse beginning at 12, the brain damage, and the system that had returned Noah to a home in which 2 siblings had already died under suspicious circumstances. Judy Grimes, Brittany's aunt, who had taken in the surviving 7-year-old daughter Hayley and would raise her, addressed the court. She asked the court to imagine what it must be like for the last thing a small boy sees in this world to be his own mother as she ends his life. Brittany Pilkington is incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. The Marysville facility is the state's primary women's prison and houses the women in Ohio's longest-running sentences. Brittany was, at the time of her admission, one of the youngest women in the facility, carrying a 37-year-to-life sentence. The earliest she will be eligible for parole consideration is in the early 2050s, by which point she will be in her early 60s. She has not, in the time since her sentencing, made a public statement of any kind to the press. The Ohio Reformatory for Women's standard practice on inmate press access is more restrictive than Florida's or Colorado's. No interview with Brittany Pilkington has ever been published in any outlet. The defense statement read into the record on her behalf at sentencing by attorney Tina McFall said that Brittany loves and misses all of her children and grieves for them every day. Joseph Pilkington, after his 2016 misdemeanor plea, remained in Bellefontaine. The annual sex offender registration requirement remained in force for 15 years from the date of his plea. He served no jail time at the original sentencing. He was never charged in connection with the deaths of the 3 boys, on the prosecution's framing at the time that the deaths had been Brittany's acts, and that the question of whether Joseph bore secondary moral responsibility for the household conditions in which the deaths had taken place was a question outside the reach of the criminal statute the state of Ohio was using. Haley, the surviving daughter, is raised by Brittany's aunt Judy Grimes and her uncle Dave Grimes, who had taken her in after Noah's death. Haley was 7 years old at the time of her brother's deaths. She was in elementary school when the criminal case against her mother was being prepared, and was in middle school by the time the case was finally resolved. The Grimes family kept her, by every account that has been given publicly, out of the courtroom on the days when her parents were in it. Judy Grimes addressed Judge O'Connor at sentencing on Haley's behalf, rather than ask her niece's surviving daughter to give a victim statement of her own. The Logan County review of the Children's Services protocols that had returned Noah to the household 6 days before his death changed the agency's standards on returning children to a home where prior unexplained infant deaths had already occurred. The new protocol specified that the death of a previous infant sibling under unexplained circumstances would now be treated on the agency's case assessment grid as a documented risk factor weighted against return of remaining children to the parental household. The protocols did not become a state law. They became, in the same way the decree review in Pennsylvania 5 years later would, a departmental document. The family court judge who had returned Noah, Dan Bratka, was named in subsequent reporting by the Dayton Daily News. He continued to serve on the Logan County Family Court bench. There was no formal disciplinary action. 10 mothers, 10 families, 3 continents and 31 children dead at the hands of the people who were supposed to raise them. The cases on this list span more than 30 years, and the line that runs through every one of them is the same line. Subscribe so the next investigation finds you when it lands, and we will see you on the next case.